I want you to consider the idea of the novelist as God. Obviously, I'm speaking figuratively. You might think, well, that means the omniscient narrator, person who knows everything about the characters. But I have something quite different in mind.
No.
Could you, in fact, demonstrate your control, your power, through style, and through structure, and through composition, and through arrangement? These are issues that very much interest other writers. They interest professors of literature. Not sure that they interest everybody else. Be curious to know what people think about that. And there's a residual question, that what remains after this type of operation has been performed, or after love itself has been deconstructed, which I essentially argued in my last lecture. So we know that Flaubert's novel registers the failure of great romantic projects of love and desire. That's the kind of cliche about the novel itself. Everybody knows it. And I can't quarrel with that. It will always be read in that fashion, and that's not a wrong reading. But unlike other 19th century novels about tragic love, it also commands our attention, it seems to me, as a very stunning and complex verbal artifact. Proust, Joyce, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and others who followed in the wake of Flaubert have saluted him, have acknowledged him essentially as one of the tutelary figures. In fact, I think you could say that The Great Gatsby is a kind of American remake in some sense of Madame Bovary. You change the gender, but you still have a kind of hero of desire. If Flaubert is the fellow who contains within himself the two warring spirits of romance and reality, then it won't surprise us that his book is a kind of multi-voiced and multi-toned affair. It also prides itself on being impersonal. T.S. Eliot wrote later in the early 20th century about the need for being impersonal as a poet, and Eliot, like Flaubert, was reacting against the cult of ego and the cult of gushing feeling that are identified with Romanticism. This view of art would view that art as a kind of weaning of emotion. I'm not sure how much truth there is in that. It sounds escapist as well to me, but I want you to bear that in mind, because let's consider the fact that if you write in an impersonal way, then it may be the case that feeling bleeds through in other ways in your book, because emotion can't be banished entirely from the scene. Flaubert invented what is called the free indirect discourse. It's a model, it's a way of writing. And the free indirect discourse means that you write subjectivity in the third person. It's not in quotation marks anymore. That he will use a third person descriptive phrase, and you will realize, as you negotiate that phrase, that this is definitely the point of view or the bias of a particular character. So the character's likes and dislikes lard the text, even if they're not in quotation marks. Flaubert regarded art as not editorializing. He did not think that the author's authority was supposed to be openly displayed. In fact, he once said that the writer or the artist is like God in the universe. He's behind the scenes, he's all-powerful, but he's never visible. Well, what does that mean? And what does that open the door to? If the artist is behind the scenes and all-powerful but never visible, that might be an invitation for a remarkable kind of bullying, that the artist moves the people around, the characters in particular, creates a kind of plot in which the characters become cogs or ciphers, but the artist never sort of displays his hand in any open way, saying, I am doing this. I mention all of this because this is going to be fertile in the development of modern literature. And we see it most profoundly in the work of James Joyce. It's an interesting notion, by the way, too, if you think about it. The idea that a character could be a kind of toy, or let's make it really ridiculous, a frisbee that the writer plays with. You could also say, well, that's kind of an analogy for our lives. That maybe we are also toys and frisbees and marionettes that some greater force is tossing about. I won't push that, but just bear it in mind. Flaubert wrote with incredible care. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that no one ever wrote as carefully with as much scrutiny, as much agony as Flaubert did. He called the style, it's well known in French, le mot juste, the exact word. And it meant that for him, and this is almost a magic theory, it meant that there was only one exact word right for every phrase, every situation, and the job of the writer was to come up with that word. And that's not just the meaning of the word, it's the sound of the words, the shape of the words, the look of the word. And when Flaubert wrote in the room in his house where he wrote, he called it the gueuloir. And gueuler is to sort of yell at people in French. And that's what he did. He would shriek out his prose to hear how it sounded before finally electing which words he was going to use. He wrote with extraordinary care, but with also great, great slowness. At times, the style of his book can be aggressively generic, and I want you to think about both those terms. What does it mean for a style to be aggressive, where it gets our attention? Often, we write in such a way that the words will almost disappear behind the meaning they're supposed to convey. In Flaubert's case, we are aware that there's a very polished, sort of purposive style. It has punch. For example, in the description of people attending Emma's wedding, we'll have phrases that will say things like that the shirts stood out from chests, ears stood out from heads, as if shirts and ears had their own agency, and that the people themselves were merely the kind of site, the place where the shirts and the ears were doing their business. That's what I mean when I say generic. It's a kind of systemic picture of people. Or at the Vaubyessard ball that Emma goes to, where she's so impressed by the elegance of these people, we will hear things like, the trumpet uttered its note. Well, trumpets don't utter their note. Someone is blowing a trumpet. Flaubert has altered that to say the trumpet will utter its note. The feet marked time. The skirts swelled and rustled. Hands touched and parted. Eyes that had been lowered now gazed at you again. And I hope you can hear what is strangely impersonal, sort of automatic, generic in all of this. There's no individual volition, no individual choice, no individual gesture being talked about. It almost sounds like a factory. Flaubert openly expressed the kind of loathing and boredom that he experienced for his story. I've already mentioned that. And there's a kind of contempt that one sees occasionally in this book, and that's not easygoing. We don't expect writers not to like what they're doing, what they're writing about. He's capable of really giving you the knockout punch. I cited in the last lecture one of the kind of really sort of critical, cold remarks about Emma. Sometimes he can be a little more interesting about this. About Léon, at one point he says, every notary bears within him the débris of a poet. It's an interesting line, actually. I mean, on the one hand, it's a kind of zapping line about Léon, the débris of a poet. But to say that inside of each of us, even if we're just bookkeepers, or if we are janitors, or whatever we are, there is the débris of a poet. That's a kind of provocative line, it seems to me. It's got something in it that makes us think. Another feature of his style is the seeming distraction of the narrative voice. It is capable of focusing on material outside the purview of the main characters themselves. One critic once wrote that Flaubert's novels, or his characters, are such that they are perfectly constituted for us not to be interested in them. That's a pretty severe statement, because I think most of us are interested in Emma Bovary. But there'll be whole pages where, in some sense, the camera of the style, the camera of the writing, leaves Emma and Léon and Rodolphe to talk about other things, and they are virtually backgrounded. They become sort of ancillary to what's going on. In fact, one of the most famous passages in the book is like that. It's a kind of neat passage. I'm going to tell you about it. It's a passage which marks the time that Emma finally has sex with Léon in Rouen. As I told you, remember, she goes to Rouen, meets him at the opera. The two of them realize that they're going to have an affair, and he's quite hungry to make this thing get actualized, as is she. And they have a rendezvous in the cathedral, beautiful cathedral, by the way, in Rouen. And they have this man taking them throughout the cathedral. It's driving Léon crazy. It's taking so much time, seeing all the sights.